Welcome everyone to this video on how to structure a Unit 2 Section B essay. This essay is a little bit different to that Section A essay. In Section A, you only need to analyse one poem and you're only being assessed on AO1 and AO2. For this essay, the expectation is to comment on 4 different poems and make those connections. What I'd like to do in this video is to show you how you can maximise those connections in terms of the structure that you place upon this essay. The main focus, therefore, is to effectively structure a Section B essay. There are lots of ways that this could be done. I'm going to show you some of those examples today and show you why I think one particular structure is probably more fruitful and will allow you to get as many AO4 marks as you possibly can. What I'm looking for is for all of you to understand how to structure this essay. I'd also like you to understand how to maximise those opportunities for getting those connections marks, for making those purposeful, meaningful connections between those poems. And then finally, to understand the common mistakes that people often make, because if we can avoid those, it means your essay is going to be much stronger. The mark scheme that you are going to be assessed on is on screen at the moment. It has 5 different strands, as you know, AO1, AO2, AO3, AO4 and AO5. The most challenging part of this particular essay is balancing those assessment objectives. They're not all worth exactly the same marks. They seem to be varied. For example, AO5 is only worth 10 marks, and yet AO4 is worth an enormous 30 marks for this essay. So what you need to do is intelligently design the structure of your essay to allow you to access that band 5 of this mark scheme. It would be a shame if you structure it incorrectly and don't give you the opportunities that you need in order to hit those 30 marks for AO4. The main issue that will happen if you don't structure it properly is that AO1 won't be a very well developed argument. In order to hit that band 5, you need a well-developed argument, and I believe your structure will help you develop that argument if you follow my advice in this video. I'm going to pay particular attention to get you to write in a way that will allow you to have those productive and discerning comparisons and connections between the poems and the poets. So this video, whilst it's all about essay structure, the main purpose of that is to open up that door for AO4 particularly. With 4 poems to cover, and you only get 75 minutes to complete, it's really important that we consciously structure your essay. When we consider the structure that we're going to use for AS level, it's a little bit different to how you were probably advised to do things at GCSE, particularly when it comes to the unseen poetry essay. I've seen lots of different structures being used at GCSE, and they've been used productively. They have been used to get marks. We are going to have to move away from those structures and then do something a little bit different at AS. But you'll see that there's a clear link between what you used to do and why we have to develop that now. So the first structure that I'll show you is something that I see from students who try and mimic what they've done at GCSE level, and they try and apply that to AS, and I don't think it's successful. I can understand why you've been taught this at GCSE, but we do need to move away from it. It's simply not going to be sophisticated enough to allow us to hit all 5 of those AOs. So very often students will try and write this essay with 4 poems being analysed at the same time, and they'll do this. They'll start with an introduction, which obviously is a very sensible thing to do. But then they'll start and they'll analyse poem 1 in detail. So they'll analyse poem 1 in isolation on its own to really garner as much information as they possibly can from it, to really analyse as much as possible, and they will be rewarded with assessment objective marks there, because they'll hit AO1 and AO2. They might even bring in context for AO3, and they'll bring in some AO5, some different interpretations. But if we do this, then we won't hit the AO4, will we? We won't have the connections. What they'll then do is they will analyse poem 2, and they'll analyse that in lots of detail. Then they'll analyse poem 3, then they'll analyse poem 4, and then they'll have the section that has the links. They'll keep a link section to the end of the essay. Now, whilst I understand entirely why they might do that, because they think, right, let me analyse poem 1, poem 2, poem 3, poem 4, then I've talked about them all, and then all of my connections will make sense because I've already introduced the poems, I understand the logic there completely. However, what I see from this is as you're analysing poem 1, 2, 3 and 4, you will be getting AO1, AO2, AO3 and AO5 marks, I completely agree, but we're leaving that 30 marks available until the very end of our essay. And for me, the whole point of this essay is it's a comparative essay. The main focus is to compare these poems. I don't understand why we'll be leaving that really important focus until the end. So the big question it makes me ask is, what if we run out of time? If we run out of time writing the essay in this structure, then we're going to miss out on all of those AO4 marks. And why would we wait until the end of an essay to get 37.5% of our marks? It's the biggest AO. We need to foreground those connections and not leave them, not abandon them. And why would we deal with poems in isolation when the whole purpose of this essay is to compare? Now, when we do the unseen poetry at GCSE, lots of people are taught to analyse poem 1, analyse poem 2 and then make connections. And that might have worked at GCSE. You can be rewarded for that at GCSE. At A level, I think it's different. At A level, we need to show the sophistication of adding connections, of making those connections from the start of our essay. The second structure I'd like to show you is one that can work at AS level. However, it does have some drawbacks that I'd like to make you aware of. So structure 2, different to structure 1. Structure 1 simply will not work at AS. It's not going to be strong enough. Structure 2 can work if done well, but there are other ways I think I can encourage you to take that I think will lead to an improved essay. And also prepare you more for the A2 sections like section B of Unit 3. So structure 2 is this. It starts in the same way as the last one. It starts with an introduction, no complaints there. What structure 2 then does is the same as the first one, which is to analyse poem 1 in detail. A lot of students like to focus on one poem first and then bring in the connections afterwards. So in this scenario, they analyse poem 1 and then when they analyse their second poem, they link it back to poem 1. That way they've already made lots of interesting points about the first poem, and then poem 2 will explore those natural connections. So as they analyse poem 2, they reference as much as possible back to poem 1. And that's a very sensible thing to do. In terms of the difference between this one and the last one left the connection till the very end, whereas in this scenario, they're leaving the connections until they've looked at the first poem in isolation. What they then do is they introduce poem 3. And when they introduce poem 3, then they make natural connections back to poem 1 and poem 2. So as they go through, they're making more and more connections and they're cross-referencing these poems. What they then do is analyse poem 4 and they will link back to poem 1, poem 2 and poem 3 where necessary. Now, as you can see from the arrows that I've put on screen, this can get a little bit complicated because instead of dealing with poems in comparative connections, what we have now is we have poems that are being cross-referenced all the way through each other. And that is a sophisticated way of doing it, but it would be an easy way of getting lost. And then obviously finishing with a conclusion. So this one is stronger because you'll notice that the AO4 marks are being garnered much earlier than in the last example. However, it is complicated and it does get a little bit difficult to track the essay and to see what's going on. So this one, it focuses on those connections much earlier. It does have opportunities to capitalise on those natural connections as the essay develops, and those connections are much more centralised. You know, those connections actually form part of this essay instead of being stuck on at the end. They're not being annexed, are they? Now, while structure 2 does have a lot of positives, I think the biggest drawback is there's a potential to get lost as the essay develops, and you might lose your central argument because you're too busy dotting back, you know, moving from one place to another, talking about poem 1 and then ending up with poem 3 and then 2 comes in and then we end up with... There are a lot of ways to get lost in this type of essay. Structure 2 can work if done well, but it can be quite complicated. This next structure is a little more simplified than the previous one. The previous one gets a little bit out of hand and it can ruin the trajectory of our essay if done poorly. Structure 3 is much more simple, however, it does retain those connections that are so vital. So it begins in the same way, introduction and then the analysis of poem 1 in isolation, And then what this student might do is they might make the connections with poem 1 when they introduce poem 2. So they analyse poem 1, and then as soon as they do poem 2, they link back to poem 1. What they then do is introduce their third poem and analyse that in isolation. And then during their analysis of poem 4, then they're making those links back to poem 3. Now the student who opts for this type of structure, all they need to worry about are the connections whilst analysing poem 2, going back to poem 1, and then whilst analysing poem 4, linking back to poem 3. This student isn't trying to cross-reference all of the poems at exactly the same time, which can be quite difficult to do. This student is linking the poems, so we have poem 1 and poem 2 being dealt with connections, and then poem 3 and poem 4 being linked with and connections, perhaps making those connections much deeper and perhaps making them much more relevant as well. Now, again, this has drawbacks as well, because again, we're focusing on the analysis of poem 1 and poem 3 in isolation and only bringing in those connections later, but this structure can work. You'll notice that this student is getting AO1, AO2, AO3 and AO5 all the way through the essay, and they have built in those opportunities to get in specific AO4 marks, and this way they're only ever flicking back between 2 poems. They're not trying to flick their books between 4 poems all at the same time. These connections are more manageable than the one on the previous slide. There are opportunities to capitalise on those natural connections, and it can make your essay a little bit clearer because you're not trying to do too much all at the same time. Now, all of the structures that I've shown you so far seem to have something in common, and that is the desire to analyse a poem on its own, in isolation, not starting the essay with connections from the very start. As we move to A level, that's what we need to develop in our skill set. We need to be able to centralise those connections from the very start of our essay, and that being the backbone of our essay, not simply this poem, this poem, this poem, this poem, but actually starting it with this connection and this connection. So we're centralising those connections rather than centralising the poems. So structure 4 is the more sophisticated of all of the structures, and it may take a little bit of time to master, might be a little bit of adjustment in order to produce this type of essay. But this type of essay will start with the introduction and then deal with poem 1 and poem 2 at the same time. So instead of saying poem 1 does this, this type of student might say both poem A and poem B both deal with, or both use this technique, or both employ this type of persona. So a little bit more tricky because you have to deal with both poems at the same time, moving back and forth from one poem to another. What the student will be able to do once they've probed the connections between poem 1 and poem 2, they then move on to the second 2 poems. So poem 3 and poem 4 will be analysed together at the same time, probing those connections, centralising the connections, instead of leaving the connections as a subplot to be dealt with later on, and then obviously ending with a conclusion. Now this type of structure takes much more practice and it is a little bit more tricky in places. However, I believe this is the structure that you will be able to employ best to get those AO4 marks that are so desired. Now it's very important at this stage to make sure that you realise that poem 1 and poem 2 in this structure cannot be from the same poet. Now my advice is make poem 1 Duffy or Larkin, and then make sure the other one is poem 2. So for example, Duffy, poem 1, Larkin, poem 2, and then when you introduce poem 3 and poem 4, you can reverse them if you want to. So poem 3 becomes Larkin, and then poem 4 becomes Duffy. It's very important that you realise that AO4 is not just connections between the same anthology, you have to make connections across the anthology. Now this doesn't mean that if you come up with a really good point when you're analysing poem 3 and poem 4, it links so well with poem 1, you think this is a great point. You absolutely can drip those points in if you want to, but there's no reason why you have to mix them all up like it's some sort of blender and you have to make sure that every ingredient goes in every time you make a connection. This time you're structuring your essay to maximise the connections between those 2 poems, and if you want to, you can add in a connection elsewhere. So a little bit more of a tricky structure, but I think shows much higher level of skill and much more sophistication. The reason why I think this is so strong is you're getting AO1, AO2, AO3, AO4 and AO5 from the moment you begin your essay. And that's the whole point, isn't it? We can't just decide which one of them is worth less, because ironically the one that we would leave till the end is the one that is worth most marks. Now here you've got those connections from the very, very beginning. It's much more manageable linking 2 poems instead of trying to link all 4 poems like we looked at earlier. And I think this structure is much more manageable within the 75 minutes provided. Remember, this is a short amount of time that you get. If you look at your screen, it looks much clearer. It looks much simpler to deal with, and I think makes it much more manageable for you when you're under time pressure, but also the pressure of the exams. So I think this is the way forward. You can practice all of the structures if you like to, but structure 4 is my recommendation for you. Now that we've considered how we're going to structure our writing for maximum effect, I'm going to show you some examples of paragraphs that students have written in the past. Some of these paragraphs will just be a fragment of a paragraph, just so I make the point and show you what should or should not be done. Some of them will be entire paragraphs. I'm going to try and stick to 3 paragraphs for you, otherwise this video is going to be about 3 hours long. So 3 clear examples with some clear tips of what not to do and what to try and emulate in your writing. This first example of a paragraph is exactly the type of thing I see every year when students start writing section B essays. And the reason why they do this is because they want to maximise their mark, they've looked at the mark scheme, and they think they know how to capitalise on part of the mark scheme. This type of student is always a very intelligent student. However, they fundamentally miss the point of this essay. So this is the start of their paragraph. It does continue, but this is how it starts. Philip Larkin was born in 1922, which is in the aftermath of World War I. As a result, his childhood would have been one of austerity. As he grew up, he also would have experienced the hardships of living through World War II. He did not fight in the war because he was medically exempt due to the eyesight. The reason why he may have rejected the way society was moving in the 1960s is because he could see the irresponsible excess of spending money on emerging fashions and modern technologies. That's why in Essential Beauty, he shows the irresponsible attitudes of the advertising companies. He viewed the images as unrealistic and irresponsible. What this student does, and I think it's an enormous failing in this piece of writing, is they spout lots and lots of historical context, lots of history at the start of their paragraph in the belief that that's going to be rewarded highly for AO3. Unfortunately, AO3 is not just asking for you to demonstrate your knowledge of the context. Just telling me things about what happened is going to get no marks at all. What students need to do in order to maximise AO3 is they need to make sure that the context they add is relevant to the poem that they're analysing. This student has placed context before the text. I would always suggest that you analyse poetry first and, where appropriate, bring in contextual understanding. The whole point of telling me a little snippet of the history of what was going on is so that I understand the poem better. This student wants me to understand the history, not why the history gives me knowledge of the poem. What your job is to do is to sprinkle your context throughout your essay so that I can understand the poem more. Just giving me lots of chunks of history are not going to be rewarded for AO4. Never think context is more important than text because it's worth 20 marks. Simply not the way it needs to be. The most important thing when it comes to an essay is the task, what you've been set. Then moving on to the texts, the poems, actually analysing the poems. This is an English lesson after all, not a history lesson. And then thirdly, the context gets weaved in afterwards. So please don't start your essay with context. All of the essay, to be fair to this, all of the points that this student has added, all of the history they've added is all fair. All of that could be used very, very effectively. The fact that he grew up during austerity, and the fact that the 1960s were completely different to when he was growing up, and the fact that he witnessed the horrors of World War II, and the fact that he could see that modern technologies and fashions are becoming actually quite irresponsible. All of that is absolutely brilliant, but it needs to be attached to the poem. So the first thing that you need to avoid is simply adding context. You need to sprinkle it throughout. So differently to analysis 1, analysis 2 is much stronger in terms of its balance, but again makes some mistakes that I think we need to try and avoid. Again, analysis 2 is from a very intelligent student who understands the poetry really, really well, but unfortunately don't play the assessment objective game. They don't focus on where the marks are going to come from. In Essential Beauty, Larkin shows the omnipotence of advertising boards as they face all ways and shine perpetually, spreading their vision of what life ought to be. Larkin creates the image of an existence where the population is bombarded with images of constructed, perfect lives. Larkin presents these dreams as constructions, using the large, bulky stanzas to demonstrate the inability to ignore such images. The advertising boards are cumbersome and mask the flaws of real life. Larkin uses the verbs block and screen to show that the images reject the negative aspects of life and seem to ignore their existence. Larkin suggests these images are an irresponsible and unfair construction, as they reflect none of the rained-on streets of the real world. During the 1960s, unemployment was rising along with an explosion of advertising. Larkin seems to be commenting that it is irresponsible to try and sell a chance of happiness when the happiness they offer does not exist. Larkin seems critical of the idea that purchasing items can lead to happiness, especially when they are metaphorically living in the gutter. Now, this is a good piece of writing. They're embedding their quotations successfully, they've got a clear understanding of the poem, they're analysing specific details, their language choices are sophisticated. This is a student who can achieve very highly in their qualification. However, they make the mistake of analysing this poem in isolation, don't they? If I highlight where this student is getting marks, then you'll see that there's something missing. So firstly, AO1. AO1 is getting marks here. I can award marks for AO1 because this student uses the right types of literary terminology, they're making very sensible, creative points about the poem. They are able to analyse language and consider the effect of techniques. They are able to show a deep understanding, an ability to infer deeper meaning. This student does introduce some context to getting AO3 marks. It could be a little bit more, it could be more developed. However, they are hitting that AO3. Unfortunately, this student entirely forgets about AO5, not making any comment on how certain ideas could be seen in different ways. But the biggest problem is that this student has not engaged with AO4. The student who wrote this essay is the type of student who decided they were going to analyse the first poem in isolation and then bring in a second poem afterwards. And I think it's such a shame that this student doesn't capitalise on those AO4 marks from the very start. So making sure that we hit all of the assessment objectives is one of the biggest priorities. And under pressure in an exam situation, you could forgive someone for forgetting one of those assessment objectives, but they're too important not to highlight at the very start. This example, analysis 3, is the type of writing that does everything that I've asked them to do. It avoids the mistakes of analysis 2 and analysis 1. So this student doesn't forget about balancing all of the assessment objectives they need to hit. This person hits them all very sensibly throughout the start. This is the type of student who takes the approach of dealing with 2 poems at the same time instead of analysing one in isolation and then bringing in a second poem to link it to. As I read this through, note the AO1, AO2, AO3, AO4 and AO5 that this student hit. There is one fatal flaw with this piece of writing that I'll reveal at the end though. Similar to Essential Beauty, Larkin creates an unobtainable ideal in Sonny Prestatyn to demonstrate the disconnect between perceived perfection and the realities of the world. The ironic use of Sonny in the poem's title is similar to the perpetual midsummer weather of essential beauty, as the perfect image is created which bears no resemblance to the real world. The image of the sexualized female kneeling up on the sand is one created by male fantasy in tautened clothes to reveal what is underneath, and breast-lifting arms to appear to reveal the true focus of the advertisement. Like in Essential Beauty, the first stanza is focused on describing the idealized image of the subject. Larkin deliberately describes her kneeling, then moving up to her thighs, and then to her breast-lifting arms, forcing the reader to act as the advertiser wants, distastefully leering at the female subject. Larkin demonstrates that the purpose of the advert is to sell the woman rather than what is behind her. In the 1960s, the rapid expanding consumerism used sexual images to sell their products. Some may suggest that the laughing seen in the first stanza is Larkin suggesting advertisements are laughing at their consumers as they have fallen victim to their marketing aims. Others may suggest the laughing girl is portraying a world where happiness is possible. Similarly, Larkin shows the adverts in Essential Beauty owe their smiles, cars, and even their youth to the purchasing of products. Larkin seems to continue to demonstrate his unwillingness of falling prey to these false promises. Larkin's use of coarse language shows the real world Larkin inhabits, where tits, a fissured crotch, and a tuberous cock and balls replace the perfect features which demonstrates the rejection of perfection in favour of an honest depiction of reality. The Fight Cancer poster at the end of Sonny Prestatyn is in stark contrast to the perfect images where dying smokers do not exist. What this student is able to do by choosing to analyse both poems at the same time, instead of leaving them until one after the other, is this student, and I'll highlight them in a different colour, are able to make connections from the start, therefore not ignoring those very important 30 marks for AO4. From the very start to the very end of this paragraph, there are connections. There could be more connections, but this student is maximising their AO4 marks because they're focused on dealing with those connections instead of waiting until the end to do so. This student gets plenty of AO1 marks because they're using the appropriate terminology and they have a clear understanding of the poetry that they are talking about. The student is able to make some very intelligent analysis of language and technique using quotations effectively. They are also able to pick up their AO3 marks because they are making relevant references to contextual understanding. Could be a little bit more developed. There could be some other pieces of context tied in with it, but they are hitting that AO3. And finally, they are able to consider the interpretations of others. This is a student who is very good at balancing all of the assessment objectives. Notice how the context doesn't start this essay. It's brought in as appropriate in the main section. However, the clear issue that this student has come across is they've forgotten to link the poets. This student has linked Larkin to Larkin. And unfortunately, that's not going to be rewarded highly when it comes to your essay. So this student, whilst very intelligent and is able to balance those assessment objectives, they made the fatal flaw of forgetting that Duffy needs to be linked to Larkin. So I'd encourage you to focus, and in your planning section, make sure Duffy and Larkin are the pairs of poems that you are planning. Okay, those were my 3 examples for you, ways of moving away from a GCSE style structure, ways of avoiding the types of mistakes that students normally make, but also giving you some models of how you could structure your writing too. I'm bringing you back to the assessment grid because this is why I've made this video. I need you to be hitting all of those assessment objectives. from the personal and creative response to literary texts and using terminology, all the way through to using those different interpretations. I need to see all of those marks. If you hand an essay to me or give the examiner something with no context at all, unfortunately they cannot reward you for any of those marks. You have to make sure that your piece of paper contains everything it needs in order to attain highly, and that's quite a stressful thing to do under timed conditions, so lots of practice in the run-up to the exam will be essential. Hopefully by the time the exam comes along, you are absolutely wonderful at hitting all of those, and it becomes quite natural after you've practiced it quite a few times. I'm hoping this has been useful. If you've got any questions, just let me know and I'll be happy to answer them. If you need me to make a video on a slightly different topic, just let me know and I'm sure I'll be able to oblige. Have a wonderful day. See you later.